Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Dummy for Theology. I am Joshua Knoll, and I will be your dummy today, and I'm going to be trying to describe and explain a single theological term. Today, technically two. I'm counting them as one. Um, I will be using the Pocket Dictionary of Theological Terms by Stanley Grins, David Goretzky, and Sherith Fee Nordingly to go through and discuss the terms and definitions of their book in order as they appear. You might be listening to this on YouTube. You might be listening to this through Apple Podcasts. We have a special subscription you can do on Apple Podcasts to hear all of our bonus episodes. Some of these will go on YouTube. All of these will go on the Apple Podcast subscription. So if you're listening on YouTube, you want more, and you realize sometimes you don't get this, go over to Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe on the Amazon Ministries Podcast Network. You'll get this as well as other bonus content from some of the other shows: Whole Church Podcast, Systematic Geekology, Let Nothing Move You, My Seminary Life. Great time over there. Check it out. Today, I'm going to be discussing some theological terms. So if you ever wondered, why aren't there more idiots talking about theology or explaining some of these terms so that you can understand it? Because, sometimes when an idiot explains it, just makes things easier. Well, you're in luck. Today you have an idiot. You have a dummy. It's me. And we're going to be discussing the terms a priori and a posteriori. So, a priori is just defining that as denoting knowledge that derives from theoretical knowledge rather than knowledge attained by experience. So, a priori is not by experience, it's theoretical. So, if you ever hear this in a theological context, that's what we're talking about: theoretical knowledge. A posteriori, that's denoting knowledge that derives from a deduction of experience or observations. So, something from experience, something observational knowledge, that's a posteriori. Observational, a posteriori, theoretical, a priori. Again, these are not the kind of words that I would usually use as a dummy, but I'm going to break them down for you in case you do hear them, and maybe this will help you understand them better. So, scientific method is going to help us understand a little bit of this as well, especially when we're talking about a posteriori, when we're talking about knowledge from observations or experience. That's very similar to how we get knowledge using the scientific method. So, the scientific method is a method of procedure consisting of systematic observation, measurement, and experience in the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. So, the way it works is come with a hypothesis, test it, observe what happens, experience what happens, repeat, and if it's a repeatable, then we'll say that that's a theory that's true. By the way, a theory is something that's been proven. It's a rule. Hypothesis is something that's just an idea. So when you see the evolutionary theory, what they're saying is the evolutionary rule, not something that could be true, but it is true as far as they're concerned. So we're talking about the people who came up with scientific theory. You're talking about Aristotle, great philosopher. We're talking about Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton. Some fun names. Around the 19th century is when we start using the actual term scientific method. So look for that. Some examples. Sitting in a chair. You might have heard this example of when people talk about faith versus hope, right? I look at the chair. My hypothesis is it's going to hold me up. My hope is it's going to hold me up. Then I sit in it. If it holds my weight, if I experience that this chair, in fact, does hold my weight, then I now have experiential knowledge. I've proven it. I have faith, is what the usual example is. That experience knowledge is what we're talking about when we say a posteriori. The idea that it'll probably hold me up. If no one's ever sat in the chair, then that's a priori knowledge. Being in love, it's similar no matter what. When you love someone else and they tell you you love them, it's a theoretical knowledge. Unless you are them and feeling the same things they're feeling and knowing the same things that they know, you never know for sure that they love you. That will always be a posteriori knowledge. I'm sorry, a priori knowledge. Even if you're like 99% sure, even if everything they do says that you love them, it's not something that's provable. What if questions also going to be that a priori knowledge, right? It's all theoretical. What if Indiana Jones went into space without a spacesuit? He'd probably die. But that's literally not something I can prove. That whole scenario is just assuming Indiana Jones is an alien or something. That's always going to be a priori knowledge. What if questions where you're just kind of coming up with what would happen? What if I was wrong about creation? Something I talked about on the show recently. you can only get to a priori knowledge. You cannot get to a posteriori knowledge. Where do these lines blur, though? Like, where there's some things you can't really fit easily into either category, right? So I've never observed or experienced photons, right? Like, I can't see the photons of my light coming out. I see light, but I don't see photons. I believe that that is true, though. There's been experiment and all this stuff that's proven the way we think photons work or how things work, but we can't see photons. So for me, does that put it as a priori or a posteriori, since I've never seen or experienced a photon, even if someone else has done that experiment? Hard to say, right? I've never landed on the moon. I've seen pictures, I believe it, we read the history, but it's not something that I could prove myself because I have never been there. So for me, it's a priori. For all those who've been to the moon and been to outer space, it's a posteriori. It's a little blurry when you get to some of those things. I personally have experienced miracles, right? I've seen um, people with broken limbs healed. I've seen cancer just disappear in some people. I've lived through accident myself that I shouldn't have lived through. Does that mean for me that I can say that that's experience, a posteriori knowledge, even though I can't prove it and repeat it? It's not able to do the scientific method with that. I don't know. C.S. Lewis had a really fun take on miracles. Lewis always explained, uh, he kind of had a pet peeve where people would talk about miracles and say, well, the reason they thought it was a miracle is because they just didn't understand how things work. They didn't understand science back then. Lewis got aggravated at that because, the reason they called it a miracle is because they knew that that was impossible. That's actually why they called it a miracle. They knew well enough to know that it couldn't happen that way. Um, so when we're talking about miracles, is it those who experience it? Can they say that it's a posterior knowledge, or do they have to say it's a priori because not everyone can experience, right? Um, how do we know that God is real? I can't experience, like, I can't show that experience to other people, right? It's not repeatable, God's existence. Am I really saved? How do I know about my own salvation? Like, I felt it, but how do I know that that's salvation and not some other? Maybe I had bad gas that day, right? Like, I think one good answer to a lot of these things, first off, is to realize that a priori and a posteriori, they're not a hierarchy. One knowledge is not better or worse than the other. A lot of our theoretical knowledge is more valuable, right? Um, my theoretical knowledge that my family loves me is a lot more valuable than my experiential knowledge that if I drop this on my toe, it's going to hurt, right? Um, in some things that are theoretical, um, gravity, things out in space, how light works, since I've never done it, etc. Like, some of that stuff is just as important to believe as some of the stuff that I have experienced, right? So the experience doesn't necessarily make something more or less true. A lot of things happened in history we can't prove. A lot of ways people's emotions, how other people experience the world, I can never prove that their experience is true, but it is still equally valid as something that I can prove. How do we know that we're saved? How do we know that God's real? How do we know what knowledge to value and what not to? I'm a big fan of the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Um, yeah, I'm not really Methodist, but the Wesleyan brothers came up with this quadrilateral, where there's four pillars of truth. There's the Bible, there's tradition, there is experience, and then there is knowledge. So science, all that, it has its place. Equally valid with what the Bible says, equally valid with tradition, equally valid with all these other things. That's what the Wesleyan quadrilateral kind of is. It's not saying that one is better than the other or that you can choose one. If it doesn't fit the others, who cares? It has to fit all of them. If the Bible doesn't say anything about it and you only have your own reasoning or experience, that's perfectly fine. Um, what's not fine is if you have your own reasoning and it goes against the Bible, you can't do that. If the Bible says something that goes against reasoning, then you gotta say that at some point your reasoning is wrong or how you're reading the Bible is wrong. So I think that quadrilateral is important. So you take all of these things into consideration and question all of your views until you kind of figure out what makes sense. Maybe how you're reading the Bible is wrong. Maybe your reasoning is wrong. Maybe you're experiencing things differently and you're not making correct sense of it. I mean, that's always possible. The human mind is a weird place. Maybe tradition, if you look at what other people thought, why they thought it, and understood where they were coming from and why they thought that, maybe that'll shed light into the situation. I think tradition is a lot more important than a lot of other evangelicals kind of give weight to, because it shows what people who are smarter than us thought before, why they thought that, how they got to it, and we can build on that. So, my question today would really come down to, when we're talking about these two terms, a priori and a posteriori, does an experience of God have to be shared in order to be real? If I experienced God do a miracle in my life, do other people have to see it and experience it also for it to be true? Or what if I'm the only one who experienced it? Am I just a crazy person? Think on that. Do we have to share in an experience for it to be a real experience, whether it's God or not? That's the thought I want to leave you all with today. Keep on questioning. Think about that thing. Thank you all so much for your time, for following, supporting, and subscribing to the show. If you're on YouTube, hit the like, leave us a rating. Remember that studying the nature of God and heavenly things is a form of worship that we all can join in on, and keep on struggling.